So today I'm doing a book review on Jodee Blanco's Please Stop Laughing at Me. And it's a very powerful New York Times bestseller. And there's a lot of things that I've learned as I'm working on my own memoir about race relations and bullying that I've endured in my life. And with Jodee Blanco's book, it talks about like how she grew, about like her middle school and high school life where she dealt with bullying, and it's a very very heavy writing, and it's also something that I feel like should be studied in two ways. It's definitely a dirty realism book. It's definitely a really good psychological drama, and it's also a very good contemporary issue thing that bullying is a very serious issue. But when we look back at like like eras like the 70s where she grew up, it wasn't seen as a bad thing. It was like more of a boys will be boys. School politics kind of determined who got bullied and how long and how little and whatever. With Jodee Blanco, the book starts out like with her going to her high school reunion, and then at the end of the book, it's kind of like her resolve. So it takes place in like the present time. How are people going to react? What's going to be like to kind of encourage to what's going to be like to kind of go back to that high school where she had a bad ending, and and then also the whole book is kind of like about like her issues with bullying. And it kind of starts out that she was bullied because she was standing up for some kids who were deaf. And back then, people would call like deaf people retards, or people would make fun of handicaps. There's a story of FDR that they didn't want to show that he had a handicap because the stereotype was that mentally challenged people like have mental retardation. So she stands up for a bunch of deaf kids and she gets ostracized for that. And then later on, there's this teacher who makes fun of kids with mental health issues and at the school. So like she gets bullied because of that, for standing up for those kids. And even some teachers said like, how dare you talk badly about a kid about a teacher, even though he was making a little off-color joke. And then she does theater and she does very well. And what happens is that somebody wins because of school politics one time, and then after she wins one time, somebody throws a cherry bomb in her yard. So it's kind of really like disturbing how things in the 70s were not seen as such a big deal. Like you throw a cherry bomb in somebody's yard because you don't like that they won over you. Now that could be considered domestic terrorism. When people are doing things like they're shoving snow down somebody's mouth at a school, that could be considered that could be considered murder. When somebody's left in a condition where they're shaking and traumatized, that could be considered attempted murder, harassment. Um, when people are making fun of somebody else's bodies, like she had an issue with her breasts, like one growing bigger than the other, a medical issue. And like when people found out about that, people were talking about that. Nowadays, that's sexual harassment to talk about anybody's condition, and it's worse because it can be considered. It's not ableism. Ableism is more towards disability or handicaps, and I think that it might fall into that category. But like back then, it was seen as suck it up, or that's not a big deal, or oh well, you're being dramatic. So, I like how she talks about those issues. The other thing that I really like is that she talks about like the issues around psychology very well. That she talks about like how she was locked in a room with her psychologist until she kind of confessed how she felt. She also talks about how they really, really believed in pushing medications on kids, and they also kind of really believed in, psychologists were, like psychologists were never wrong. So, she had a bad experience with a psychologist, and it doesn't really it really does damage to her. But also too, she also talks about like how her parents were very supportive of her through a bulk of it, but in the beginning they just thought that she was just being a misfit, quote unquote, or that she has like a disability or a mental disability that she can't make friends or just keep a good thing going, until they actually see the viciousness that she suffers. And I really just think that and I really think that this story does a really good job capturing that, because like back then, there was a lot of stigmas around getting mental health, and also like psychologists could treat you whatever way, and what they said went. I think that there's a lot of things that I want to say about it as a good literary piece. The only thing that I hated about the book is that I really hated how they played. Like I was listening to the Audible tape, and I really hated how in the beginning of the book And even the last like page, you heard like this sappy piano music. It just it throws the book really deeply under the bus. Like it feels overly melodramatic or forced emotion. So I really just didn't like that. And the other but now I'm going to talk about the things that I do like, and there's a lot positive that she really talks about character development very well. You really first of all, I'm going to say that she talks about she really talks. This is written in the first person narrative, and she really captures her anxiety very well, how she feels about things. Um, like what stress she has is her realizations on people. And It's done extremely well. And I think that that's a lot of stuff that I think, and I really think that there's a lot of things we can all take away to be better writers from those things. The other thing that I will say is that she's very, very good with multiple characters. That there's a lot of characters with really great descriptions. If they mean something to her, she doesn't mention them one time. She mentions their actions and what they mean to her. So like having friends that betrayed her, friends she stood up for that betrayed her or leave her alone, people that she had a crush on, just being becoming despicable, and then just people that she knew in high school, who later on just afterwards, she kind of met in the future and they turned out to be better people, or like some people that gave her realizations about herself. So I really think that her usage of other characters is very, very strong, and I think that that's really good. I also really would say that another thing that I will take away from this is that she's really, really strong with levity. And the thing is, if you're writing a really dark story about like like bullying or abuse or whatever, you really need some scenes in it that that have levity, because it can't just be nonstop darkness. Usually those stories don't do that good and it becomes melodramatic. Like, like I talk about the anime Elfen Lied, where it's nonstop watching bad things happening to the main characters, and it gets to a point where it's kind of like, cartoonish. I'm writing a book, memoir about bullying, and because of this book, what happened was I decided to revise my chapter. What happened to include more levity. So I was doing this chapter about how I was very naive and I rented out my Game Boy when I was a young kid, and I didn't get it back. And what happened was one kid overheard it, and then he decides to go home and tell my dad what happened. And then later on, he decides to tell the school, because my parents are gay, what it's like to kind of see my dad and talk about me and talk about my life. And then my teacher kind of just like got him in trouble for doing that. And also my dad was known to kind of flip out really easily over stuff like that. So, what I learned from her piece is that I included a scene where when I went to rent it out my Game Boy, I got Pokemon cards, I got money, so I went to a Burger King and I enjoyed myself. So I'm writing that in my book because the Burger King thing and just feeling like a king, because it helps that chapter. And sometimes if you write about really dark subject matter, it's not powerful if you're always playing the same key. Like people talk about Quentin Tarantino movies, that he uses a lot of black comedy in the violence, and a lot of like times when he talks about racism. You see that in Django Unchained. They're joking about him being on a horse, and then you see a future scene where you see how Leonardo DiCaprio's character Calvin Candy is very like abusive towards his property. So like in Tarantino films, you see levity, and then you also see the brutality, but like you need to make levity to make the brutality more powerful. And also with characters too, and I'm also doing this in my own pieces, that sometimes there are bad people, and or people who do bad things and they become better people, or they just don't know how to handle a situation, so they choose a bad side. So I think that when I write about how my parents were harsh on me, I always talk about how my dad lived up in Connecticut because he wanted a better life. He lived out of a motel for a while, and then he made connections, and then he got a good job and a good house. And then I also talk about like how on the weekends when he could come home, he would bake a cake for everybody. He was into cooking at that time. So even, and also too, I wasn't an easy kid to raise, so he struggled. He was kind of a frustrated person, but never abusive. But but I also kind of incorporate the times when he kind of when he was kind of short tempered, or he kind of was just yelling and just being like an immature adult and just going really far with it. Like I talk about a time where one of my relatives who was taking care of me flipped over a table because I didn't eat a hot dog because I took too big of a piece of a pie of I took too big of a piece of a bite of a hot dog, so they decided to flip over a table. But I also talk about that relative a lot more in my writing and just say, well, now I understand like the other sides of this person. So levity is very important in writing. I also feel that another thing is that she talks about movies and like A Clockwork Orange and just being in the therapy chair and feeling like she's strapped down like Alex in A Clockwork Orange. So I like how she references movies and other stuff like that because I remember my professor in college saying you never ever make pop culture references. If you want to reference something, reference Shakespeare. And I told him like, and I remember telling people like that's one of the most stupidest things you can ever say as a writer. Don't talk about anything concurrent. But but yeah, I like how she references movies, but she does it in a way that to make sense. So she says like, she references Grease, she references being strapped down like Alex and Clockwork Orange, but she makes sense of it. I was writing another chapter about being bullied at summer camp, and I was talking about like how I watched Dragon Ball Z and I saw Goku become Super Saiyan through his anger, and I said like how when I stood up and I was cursing at my bullies, and I was threatening them, wasn't the right thing to do, but when I was threatening them, I felt almost like Goku becoming Super Saiyan. It was a new level of anger that I never felt before, but it felt good. Just like, but I also learned like, just like what Goku did, like, which was, he took that anger and he made a positive out of it years and years later after I did that. So, you want to reference. So when you are like doing it, when you have a character and they're into movies or they're into anime or they're into like writing or whatever, they have a hobby, you can reference that to how they feel, and that makes it powerful. You make a character with a lot of dimension, and also you make a character that's very imaginative that way. So like her character development is very, very strong in this piece. It is a very good dirty realism piece of literature. I think that she talks about the 70s very well. I think she talks about like the complacency towards bullying, and how there's a lot of retaliation bullying very well. Very, very beautiful piece of writing. Everybody should read this, rightfully so. It is being taught in high schools. And I think that this should be mandatory. And this should be mandatory in all high schools, and also too, like it's a very good piece of women's literature. She's not a millennial. She was born in like this. She was born possibly the '60s. She's a baby boomer, but I think that the millennial generation, this anti-bullying culture, this is a very good book to read. The same way James Baldwin is he was a big writer in the 60s. A lot of his work is relevant now. This work is still relevant. This book was published in 2003, and this was really before bullying was taken very seriously. Back then, people still had like that suck it up, you're a bitch, or you're a pussy for talking about bullying. But nowadays, it's taken a lot more seriously, and people understand the repercussions of bullying. And I think I like what she said in her epilogue, which is, when people look at Columbine and other stuff, people at like in the 90s or 2003, they did not really say, okay, bullying was a cause. And in my own piece, I do the exact same thing where I talk about that too. And I was actually in 1999, I was actually bullied, and I remember being a kid in elementary school when Columbine came out, and I said the exact same thing, which is very scary. Which is, they don't look at bullying as a cause of it. They just look at kids they just blame kids for having mental health issues or being violent or whatever. They don't see bullying as a root of the causes. So, I think this is a very beautiful piece. It's a very important piece of literature. Rightfully so, it's a New York Times bestseller, and it stands the test of time. So everybody should read Jodee Blanco's Please Stop Laughing at Me. And I really thank her for writing this. She's a very strong person. As I said, like I wish I can give her a hug, but I want to say too that she's made me a stronger writer. I've been very busy. I've been working really hard with my writing. I've written over 100 pages this year. I'm also into filmmaking and other stuff, but there was a point where I just said like I'm just not gonna look at any more books because I'm so busy. But I'm happy that I changed my mind and I managed to read this. So very, very good piece of literature. All right, I'll talk. All right, that's all I got to say about Jodee Blanco's Please Stop Laughing at Me. Very beautiful book, very well written, and everybody should take a read of this.